Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at the symmetrical English, and more importantly, we're going to specifically be looking at the variation where we play c4, c5. White's going to play knight f3 and threaten to play d4. We're going to play knight f6 and threaten to play the Kasparov gambit against their d4. So that would be after d4, cd4, knight d4, we're going to play e5. And they decide that they want to back out, and they're going to go ahead and just hang back and play passively and play knight c3. So when they decide to hang back and play passively, we say, no, we still want to play aggressively. If you're not going to play the white pieces, we will. We're going to go ahead and take our aggressive share of the center. We're going to play d5, and we're going to play these exciting positions. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that like button. Please hit subscribe and click on your notification icon. So anyways, what happens after d5? Well, of course they're going to take, and we're going to play knight takes d5. So basically, black's plan is the same as what white's plan would have been if white had played an early d4. Black's plan is just to finish his development as naturally as possible, to play knight c6, g6, bishop g7, and castle, and then just have a slightly better position because we have a greater share of the center than what white has. We have a pawn on c5, attacking the middle of the board, and white is going to have to work for his pawn break with moves like e3 and d4. Now, from this point, there's a lot of options. I would say by far and away, the most common thing that you're going to see at almost every level is going to be the move g3. But this passive approach actually makes it very easy for black in most cases to finish his development and to get to a position where he's either slightly better or at the very least completely equal. The other approach is to get aggressive in some way, shape, or form. Now, the two main weapons for this are either e3 or e4, so we'll go ahead and examine those right away. So they could play e3 immediately. They could play e3. Now, my suggestion for all of these moves is, again, sort of an opening simplification technique. It's just a way for you to simplify your opening preparation. Against e3, I personally just like taking. I personally like just playing knight takes c3. And for those of you that are Grunfeld players, if you're familiar with the Grunfeld, if they reply with bxc3, what we're doing is we're basically transposing into a Grunfeld where they've played this passive pawn to c3. They don't have as aggressive. They have the pawn on c3. Well, that's normal in the Grunfeld, but the pawn on e3, as you can see, is passively placed. They haven't played e3. They're going to have to play e3 to e4 at some point to get that big share of the center that they usually have in the Grunfeld that compensates for black's easy development. So an example would be from this game, Balagan versus Fiddler in Norway in 2013, which continued bishop g7, bishop b5 check, knight d7, and the reason he blocks with the knight is not only because the knight is worth less than the bishop, it's because he intends to develop his bishop via b6 and bishop b7 in kind of classic Grunfeld style. So castles, castles, and then he just continues just playing normal Grunfeldish moves, and develops his pieces, gets a good game, and puts some pressure on white's c-pawn, and just continues with normal natural development. He exchanges some pieces. Finally, white gets in his e4. It had to happen eventually, but black has a very nice position in the middle of the board. And things end up going really well for black. Black just keeps putting pressure on white's position. Black has the more active pieces now, and now black is starting to go after white's pawns. So after rook a4, he goes after the pawn on a6. He's hitting the pawn on c4. He's hitting the pawn on a6, and something's got to give. He goes ahead and he grabs that extra pawn. White gets it back, but the pawn on c4 falls. So now black has an extra passed c-pawn that he's going to try to push up the board and make things happen. He's going to try to make that work for him, and he did. He managed to go on to win the game. It was a very long, drawn-out endgame, but Fiddler did manage to go on and win in Norway in 2013 against Balagan. So against e3, that's my recommendation. Play knight takes c3 and play the Grunfeld a tempo down. Now, against e4, if you want to, you can also do the same thing, but this, of course, is a tempo even Grunfeld. You're actually just making a direct transposition if they play b captures c3. I will also note against e3, it is possible after knight c3 for them to play, quite a few players do play dc3, and in this case you should exchange queens, play bishop f5, just develop, and these positions are supposed to be totally a-okay for black. It's not such a huge deal that white's king is still in the middle of the board, but it is just I I mean honestly I just think these positions are a little bit better for black, and black was able to prove it in Carlsen versus Bashir Lagrave in St. Louis in 2017. Black went on to win in this position. So if Carlsen isn't winning with the white pieces in this position, I think that we can declare these positions a little bit better for black. Black just has slightly better pieces, slightly better development. His king is slightly safer. The white king being in the middle isn't such a huge deal, mostly because he can hide on c2 if he needs to. But it's clearly not great that white has a difficult time finishing his queenside development in a natural way. So it is possible, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it for white, and I certainly wouldn't be afraid of it for black. So going back, so instead of e3, we can play e4. And again, you can do the same thing against e4 if you want. You can just rip on c3, and they don't really have anything better than to go into a mainline Grunfeld, and that is going to be a direct transposition of the Grunfeld, so you don't get that extra tempo where they have to two-step from e3 to e4. So if you don't want to play the Grunfeld unless you're up a tempo, if the Grunfeld isn't normally in your repertoire, you probably don't. You probably don't want to play an even tempo Grunfeld. If you wanted to do that, you would just play a Grunfeld. So you can go ahead and play knight b4. This alternative is really reasonable. And this leads to kind of a wild type of position. After bishop c4, knight d3, king e2, we're going to play knight f4 check, which is basically forced, king f1, and then we're going to be retreating this knight back to e6. So black's plan is basically the same as it was before. He wants to finish his development with g6, bishop g7, and castles. The only difference, of course, being that right now black is way behind in development. White has 3 pieces out to black's 1. But in exchange for that, white has a very awkward time finishing the development of his queenside. He's got a huge weaknesses in the middle of the board with d4 and d3. And of course, his king can never castle at this point, making it very difficult in the long run for the rook on h1 to get into the game. All of this being said, that should make the position probably about equal. But the next couple of moves are, of course, very critical. That's why I think most top players are striking right away with a move like b4, trying to take advantage of these temporary advantages that white has in terms of development. And here's where, things get kind of dicey. What we can do if we want to is we can ignore b4 and we can just go ahead and say, hey, my development's more important. Let's just go ahead and finish up. And let's get our king out of the middle. Let's play knight c6. Of course, we've done this at the expense of that pawn. But this is very playable. And black managed to get a draw in Jakovenko versus Nepomniachtchi in Russia in 2014. So that game continued like so. Everything was fine. He was able to eventually work his pieces to better squares. And as you can see, he eventually gets his pawn back, which at this point, once he gets his pawn back, this position is actually slight edge black. So it's just a little bit of struggling to get that pawn back, but once he got the pawn back, it was slight edge black, but white managed to hang on and get the draw in Jakovenko versus Nepomniachtchi in Russia in 2014. So that's one option, is when they play b4, you can just go ahead and ignore them and just finish your development. You can also take it, which is, of course, a lot more wild. So, I mean, if you take it, they're going to play knight d5, and at this point, you really have to try to finish your development. But this is the whole idea behind this, is they're going to come after your dark squares immediately, and this makes things kind of awkward, because your dark squares kind of disappear. But you do get a chance to castle, and you do get a chance to finish your development, even though it's not completely natural. It's kind of an awkward development finishing for black. But this game that we're following was Pogolevsky versus Korchnoi. So the only caveat to this game is I'm really not sure if any of these moves, even just the last couple of moves, were the best moves. Like, it's really kind of unclear. But this ended up going really well for Korchnoi back in Buenos Aires in the 1980 Candidates Tournament. Black ended up going on to win from here. After Queen d3, he exchanged some more stuff. He developed his pieces and made some very good aggressive attacking moves that ended up, of course, as you can see, ended up very well for black. So this ended up being an impossible position for white to defend in that particular game. So again, the only caveat here being I'm really not 100% sure that everything that white did was 100% accurate. But it is possible to come out of these wild positions after knight to d5 and g6 and bishop b2. It's possible to come out of these positions ahead with black with some very careful preparation. So the other thing that they can do after g6 is they can continue with pawn to d4. I'm not sure which one of these moves is more popular today. I think for the most part the e4 line, even opposed to the e3 line, it's especially this particular variation, it's kind of a sideline. So it's hard to say exactly how popular each of these moves are. But bishop to g7 got played. This was between Berkes and Jiang in Dallas in 2016. This ended in a draw, so everybody just basically finished their development. And for the most part, everything was pretty sedate and everything was fine. Nothing crazy happened. Everybody had to make a bunch of safety moves before they could get safe and get castled. Here a mistake was made, though. Black went ahead and played king f8, which is kind of interesting, when it was very possible, and also we're no longer following the Berkes game. Now we're following Aronian versus Topalov in London. The Berkes game deviated one move earlier than this. So, and that game ended in a draw. But now we're following... they deviated on move 14. Instead of queen d2, they played h4 in the Berkes versus Young game. That game ended in a draw. So the move queen d2, at this point, we're actually following the Topalov game. And Aronian versus Topalov actually ended in a win for white. But what's interesting about that game is if we fast forward to where we were a moment ago, king f8 was played in that game, and king f8 appears to be an error. If black had continued with g4, bishop c4, queen a5, knight d5, takes, this would have been still equal, possibly slight edge black, which just goes to show you how dicey these positions really are. Like, 9 times out of 10, when we start getting into these wild positions with b4 and c takes b4, I really can't make heads or tails of some of these positions. You really need a lot of computer preparation and computer analysis under your belt kind of before you go into this. So make sure that if you're going to play c takes b4, not only review this video, but review these positions yourself on your computer with an engine running, and make sure you're really familiar with everything going on. Otherwise, what I would recommend against b4 is just go ahead and give up that pawn, play g6, develop, and then worry about getting it back later. It's a little bit easier to play if you're not fully prepared for all the wild complications of accepting the b4 pawn. But again, you should be able to take it and you should be able to keep it. Theory holds right now that this should be fine, but it's going to require some highly accurate play. So going back to the main line of everything here, you're actually probably not even going to see these two moves very much. Like e4 and e3, other than at certain levels, they're not very popular. The most popular thing that you're going to see is people just hanging back and doing nothing with a move like g3. You might also see d4, and again, we can have another Grunfeld transposition with knight c3, bc3, g6. e4 is just going to transpose right back into our Grunfeld. So basically, white has a choice here. He can play a Grunfeld, or he can play g3. So we're going to have g3, and then we're going to continue with knight to c6. We're going to have bishop g2, then we're going to have g6, and then we're going to have castles. Okay, so after castles, we're going to play bishop g7. Now, it's also possible for them to play a couple of other moves here. They could play knight to g5, they could play h4, and they could even play pawn to d3. So the main thing to remember here is if they play a move like knight g5 and put pressure on this d5 knight, you're always going to be okay to just play a move like e6. Playing e6 to defend your post in the middle of the board is always fine, especially considering that they've kind of lost a tempo here with this knight. You're going to be playing, your queen is putting pressure here, that's going to force them to defend, and then you're going to be gaining an extra tempo here. And after they attack everything, this is leading to a whole bunch of nothing except just kind of helping you develop. So something like this would be a really good situation for black. This actually comes out really well for black. And this was equality in Svidler versus Gelfand in Zurich in 2017. That game continued like this, where everything kind of came off the board. But as you can see here, and I do say this a lot in my videos, if anyone is better here, I'm going to go with black. Even though white's got a lot of kind of aggressive attacking chances against the black king, I still like black's position in the center just a little bit more than I like white's position for some reason. But this just ended in perpetual, everybody going back and forth, nobody can make progress. But white didn't want to exchange queens and go into that particular endgame where maybe black's more active king would have been an advantage instead of a disadvantage. So that's basically what we're doing against knight g5. Against h4, we're just going to ignore it. We're going to play bishop g7 and bishop f5 and ask our opponent, what is he doing with all of these lost tempos? So this is another great example. This actually happened in Aronian versus Anand in St. Louis in 2017. And that game also ended in a draw, similar to the last one. Okay, so g6 castles is what you're going to mostly see. Then we're going to have bishop g7, knight d5, queen d5, d3 castles, and then bishop e3. So this is basically the super boring main line. And you have two really good options here for black to equalize. So with white's last move, he's creating a threat. He's creating the threat of playing knight to d4 and picking up some material on the c6 square. And also, he's putting pressure on c5. And it can be complicated and it can be jarring when you're looking at this move, bishop to e3, trying to figure out how you're going to hold all your pawns and also finish your development. But it's really not that hard. Basically, you're either going to move your queen back to d6 and just avoid the tactic completely, which is perfectly acceptable, or you're going to play this move, which has been respected for a very long time, to just equalize. You just defend the knight. And of course, the idea here is if you defend the knight and they play knight d4, you're going to just retreat, you're going to exchange everything, and when they go after your c-pawn, you go after their a-pawn. And you can go after their a-pawn with either queen a6, or I've seen a lot of players also play queen to e6, and it's exactly the same thing. Just as long as you go after their a-pawn in compensation, it doesn't actually seem to matter where you plant your queen. So queen a6 or queen e6 are both fine, and then when they take, you're going to kick them and take them back, and then after a few more exchanges, the position is roundabouts equal, but what's interesting is black has the pawn majority over here. So he's got a 2-on-1, and this pawn majority can actually be really, really dangerous if white isn't careful. And that's what happened in Guri versus Rajabov in China in 2012. Rajabov actually won with the black pieces after b4, queen b3, and then a5. This pawn got a rolling. And once this pawn got rolling, there was no stopping it. It just got up the board just way too fast. After queen to b2, Anish had to resign. a2, a1 is coming, and he cannot stop it. Black is covering the only diagonal that white could have gotten counter checks on. So that's one option, is we play bishop d7, and then they go after the c5 pawn, and we go after the a2 pawn. The other option is we could just retreat. We could play queen d6. There's nothing wrong with this. And then after rook c1, we do have to be very careful. b6 is not going to be a playable move here. We're not defending this knight enough times to compensate for this pin. But we can chuck this knight on the d4 square, and that's the idea of retreating the queen. So you can retreat the queen to d6 and play knight d4, or you can play bishop d7 and hold the knight. My personal preference is to play bishop d7. It seems like a slightly more accurate move. But I've also caught myself playing queen d6 on occasion because this does yield positions that are kind of fun to play. Like after knight d4, cd4, we have a nice little space advantage, and that's kind of fun. So cd4, bishop d2, we're going to play bishop g4, just develop, and after h3, bishop e6, we're not at all concerned about them taking on b7 because we always have rook b8 and rook b2. So now after they play queen to a4, we're going to play bishop d5, we're going to eventually exchange off these light-squared bishops. And this ended up being a draw in Malkov versus Nybak in 2009. But again, I mean, on the practical level, I kind of like playing the black pieces here. I prefer playing black over white because black has a little bit more space, and black has access to these light squared weaknesses, and black has managed to keep his long diagonal bishop, whereas white hasn't. It's a little bit of, exchanging and everything coming off the board in this particular game, but black had more than enough threats to keep everything going. That passed a pawn running up the board is actually a huge danger. He tried to make it work, actually. He tried to make that passed a pawn even more dangerous than it really is. But he doesn't have enough. He's just going to hold on to it. White's actually got an extra pawn at this point, but the passed a pawn is further up the board. After rook takes c6, they just shook hands and agreed to a draw, even though white has managed to get the 4-on-3 against, he just decided not to play it out. These positions are known to be draws, 4-on-3s, but they are difficult draws to get with black. Black still would have had to be very accurate, but they just went ahead and decided to shake hands. And that was Malkov versus Nybeck in 2009. So basically, that's how we're handling it. We're playing this early d5, and when they play cd5, knight d5, after g3, we're just continuing with our basic plan of playing g6, castles, bishop g7, etc. Just going to be playing this position, and that's roundabouts what all of the main lines are. So anyways, I hope you found the explanation for the main lines of this early d5 for black helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.